The wind came down off the hills in sharp-edged whispers, cutting through wool and bone. It carried the scent of pine and ash, and something else, a kind of stillness that sat heavy in the chest, the kind that settled only after death had come and gone. Her name was Evelyn Rusk, and she stepped off the stagecoach with the hem of her traveling dress soaked in red mud and her heart thudding low like a mallet against hollow wood. She wore no hat, only a worn scarf pinned at her nape, and her hands trembled though not from the cold. Before her, the town of Jespers Hollow lay in the lee of two ragged hills, a place barely marked on most maps, a place of hard winters and harder men. She'd read that in her brother's letter. Or maybe it had been a warning, cloaked in the neat looping script of James Rusk, a man who always said more in silence than in words. But she had not come for James. She had come to marry Caleb. The man who had written her short, practical letters at first, then longer ones that held warmth in their margins. Caleb had not wooed her with poetry or promises. He'd written of fence posts and calf births and the price of oats, but somehow she'd felt known in those letters. There had been one, sent in early spring, where he'd written, "There's a quiet spot past the creek with a view of the whole hollow. I reckon it'd be a fine place for a garden." She'd read it 3 times by firelight, then set about sewing her wedding dress. Now she stepped into the bone-bare light of a winter afternoon, gripping her carpet-bag, and saw the church bell swaying like a pendulum in the wind. A boy approached, freckled, thin, solemn-eyed. "You Evelyn Rusk." She nodded. "They're burying Caleb now." The words didn't hit at once. They hovered, then sank in her like stones. Caleb is dead. She hadn't even heard the boy's name, only that truth. He turned without waiting, and she followed, slow-footed, her skirts dragging like anchors. The ground had thawed just enough to dig a grave. She could smell the churned earth before she saw it. A small crowd stood around a pinewood box laid out beneath the open sky. Men removed their hats as she approached. A preacher murmured scripture. Evelyn stood a pace behind them, a stranger on the edge of grief, her face bone-white beneath the scarf. No one spoke to her. Not until the last of the words were said, the dirt falling like muted drumbeats. Then a man turned, broad-shouldered and dark-haired, with storm-gray eyes that bore down into her. She knew his face, though older now, more drawn. James, Caleb's brother. "Evelyn," he said, voice low and rough as gravel, "you weren't supposed to be here till next week." "I came early," she answered, voice small, unraveling. "I wanted to surprise him." James looked away then, to the coffin already half covered. "You did." They stood silent as the last of the grave was filled. Wind whipped her skirt, tugged at his coat. Someone offered her a handkerchief, but she didn't take it. Later at the house, Caleb's house, now James's by default, she sat by the fire while he brought in her trunk. The room was sparse, clean. Caleb's boots still sat by the hearth. "I can sleep in the barn," she said. "No need, there's a spare room." "Still, I don't want to impose." "You came to marry my brother. You're not a guest, Evelyn." He didn't say what she was now, though, widow of a man she never touched, stranger among kin. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, staring at the fire. The silence stretched like wire between them. James did not fill it. He merely stood with his back to the flame, arms crossed. "He was bit by a copperhead," he said at last. "Out near the creek, took him fast." Evelyn nodded once. "He wrote me about that creek, said it'd be a fine place for a garden." James's eyes flickered. He was clearing that spot when it happened. She closed her eyes, saw Caleb's pen strokes, felt the ache of what might have been. Upstairs, the bed was made with a patchwork quilt. Evelyn sat on the edge of it, her gloved hands trembling in her lap. In the drawer, she found a letter, unposted, folded twice. It was from Caleb. He'd written it 3 days before he died. "Evelyn, the snow's melting off the far field. I think the oats will take this year. I built the bench by the creek, like I said I would. When you come, I'll take you there." She pressed the letter to her chest, and for the first time since she'd stepped off the coach, she wept. Downstairs, James fed another log to the fire. He heard the creak of floorboards above but did not look up. His hands were calloused, his back sore from digging. He had lost a brother and gained something he didn't understand. A promise interrupted. A woman in mourning, but not for him. Night fell like a curtain. Snow began to whisper against the windows. The fire burned low, but neither of them slept. The next morning the world lay hushed beneath a thin crust of frost. Smoke curled from the chimney in a slow column, steady as breath. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hands raw from scrubbing the hearth. The scent of lye clung to her skin. She hadn't asked permission. The house had felt too still, too much like a tomb, and she needed something to do, something to lift the weight pressing down on her ribs. James came in from the barn just after sunrise, mud on his boots and hay in his hair. He paused at the threshold, eyes sweeping the room. The table had been cleared, dishes drying in a neat stack. The stove crackled with kindling she'd split herself. "You didn't need to do all this," he said. She didn't answer, just kept wiping the counter, her motions small and controlled. He took off his hat and set it down. "We ain't formal people here." She turned, slow and even. "I needed the quiet." He nodded once, that was the whole of it. Breakfast passed with little more than the clink of utensils. She ate little. He ate like a man who hadn't known how to stop working just because someone had died. Afterward, she stepped onto the porch. The morning light poured gold over the hills, catching on the remnants of snow still clinging to shadows. A sparrow landed on the rail beside her and cocked its head. Behind her, the screen door creaked. James joined her, arms folded against the chill. "Come spring, the dogwoods bloom out past that rise," he said. "Caleb used to cut branches for the table." She looked out at the empty field, imagining blossoms there. He wrote about them, said they reminded him of snow, only warmer. James gave a soft snort, half a laugh. That sounds like him. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It held room in it, like a pause between chords. "Will you go back?" he asked. She glanced over, the question settling like a weight. "To Pennsylvania." He nodded. She shook her head slowly. "There's no one left. My father's gone. The house is rented to strangers now. I don't belong there." James didn't press. He just looked at the horizon. "What will you do?" she asked him. He scratched his jaw. "Finish what he started. The fences, the oats, might run cattle down in the hollow come summer." "And the garden?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. He looked down, his voice quiet. "That's up to you." The days passed in slow rhythm. Evelyn took to feeding the chickens, patching curtains, mending worn shirts with care that surprised even her. James worked from sunup to dusk, always with the air of a man carrying something too heavy to speak of. They didn't talk much, but they shared space. One afternoon, she brought him a tin of coffee as he repaired the gate. He took it with a nod, sitting back on his haunches. "You were close?" she asked, not looking at him. He didn't answer right away. "We weren't boys anymore, but we still rode the fence together. He was the better man." "That's not what he wrote," she said softly. James looked over, expression unreadable. "What he write?" She hesitated, then pulled the letter from her coat pocket, the one she'd folded and unfolded so many times it bore the creases of grief. She handed it to him. He read in silence, lips moving slightly. When he finished, he handed it back without a word. "I think he was happy," she said. James stared down at his hands. "I hope he knew it." That night she woke to the sound of the wind howling down the chimney. She rose, padded barefoot to the stairs, and saw a light still burning in the parlor. James sat at the table, a bottle beside him, a ledger open before him but untouched. "You should sleep," she said. He didn't look up, "Could say the same to you." She stepped closer, the firelight catching in her eyes. "You don't have to carry all this alone." He looked up then. "It's not just the work." She sat down across from him. "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, the pain in him so plain it made her chest ache. "I keep hearing him, in the barn, on the trail. Sometimes I think I'll turn and see him leaning on the doorframe, grinning like a fool." She reached across the table, laid her fingers gently over his. He didn't pull away. "I don't think grief ever leaves," she said, "but it makes room, slowly." He nodded, the motion barely there. Outside, the wind cried through the trees. Inside, their hands stayed joined, and neither spoke again until the lamp burned low. In the weeks that followed, spring began to show itself in tentative ways, buds on the trees, thaw in the soil. Evelyn began tilling a narrow strip by the creek. She found the bench Caleb had built, rough-hewn, a little crooked but solid. She sat there often, hands in her lap, eyes turned skyward. Sometimes James joined her. Sometimes he just watched from a distance. The house no longer felt like a waiting place. It began to breathe again. But there were things unsaid, things buried deeper than any grave. And not everything Caleb left behind had been meant for Evelyn. Not everything had died with him. Not yet. By April, the creek ran clear with snowmelt, and the first shoots of green pierced through the thawed ground like cautious whispers. Evelyn stood in the garden with her skirts pinned up in earth beneath her nails, coaxing life from the soil Caleb had once walked. She spoke to the seeds as she pressed them in, not in prayer, but in memory. In that loamy silence, she felt closer to him than at his grave. James watched her from the rise one morning, arms folded, hat pushed back. She worked with a kind of steadiness that reminded him of his mother's hands, long gone now. Not fast, not delicate, but enduring. He'd never seen Caleb plant anything. That afternoon he rode to town for supplies. When he returned, there was a parcel waiting on the porch, plain brown paper, tied with twine. She met him at the steps. "I ordered it before I left home," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Didn't think it'd still come." He handed her the parcel without a word. Inside was a wedding dress, simple, soft linen, hand-stitched. She held it up against the light, and the weight of it made her knees buckle, not from sorrow, from the absence of what might have been. That night she hung it in the spare room closet and did not open it again. The following week a stranger arrived. Midday sun at his back, his coat dusted with trail dirt, eyes sharp beneath a wide-brimmed hat. James met him at the gate, rifle slung but hand resting near the grip. "Can I help you?" he asked. The man nodded once. "Name, Merrick. I was a partner of Caleb, rode fence with him last summer out past the Elk Range." James didn't move. "Don't remember him mentioning you." Merrick's mouth tightened. He wouldn't have, it was short work. Evelyn came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. "You knew him." Merrick looked at her long, then removed his hat. "Ma'am." She stepped down. "You come for something." The man hesitated. "Just passing through, heard he passed, thought I'd pay respects." James narrowed his eyes. "You heard that from where?" "Over in Danton's Creek. Word moves." Evelyn nodded. "You're welcome to sit. I've tea on the stove." Merrick inclined his head. "Obliged." He stayed through the evening, asked questions that sat too neat in the mouth, talked more than Caleb ever had, said things that didn't quite ring true. Evelyn watched him with the eyes of someone who's been lied to before and learned how to listen past the words. After he left, James stood on the porch long after dark, jaw tight. "You don't believe him," she said. He shook his head. "Caleb never trusted easy, and that man, he's looking for something." "What?" James didn't answer, but he checked the locks that night, twice. The next day, James went out to the south pasture. Evelyn followed after, needing to clear her mind. She brought bread and cheese wrapped in cloth. They ate beneath a cottonwood tree, sun dappling through its fresh leaves. "I've seen men like him before," James said, "the kind that remember you when they need something." She watched a hawk circle overhead. "Do you think he had something to do with Caleb's death?" James shook his head. "Snakebites real enough, but maybe he came back for something Caleb left behind." "What would Caleb have worth coming back for?" James looked at her, and she felt it, the weight of his silence. "He wasn't just planning a wedding, was he?" she asked. "No," James said quietly. "He was planning to sell the upper tract, old mining land, dangerous, but there's copper in it. Merrick might have wanted a piece." Evelyn frowned. "Then why didn't he say that?" "Because he thinks it's still here, and maybe he thinks you know where it is." The idea made her stomach twist. "I don't." "Neither do I," James said, "but we'd best figure it out before he comes back." They began searching the house, not frantically but with method. James took the ledger, Caleb's old maps, the shed. Evelyn sifted through letters, books, the drawer where he used to keep seed catalogs and receipts. In an old boot, stuffed with rags and forgotten under the bed, she found a scrap of paper with only a drawing, 3 hills, and a mark between them. She brought it to James. He stared at it, then nodded. That's the ridge past Dog's Hollow. You know the place. Too steep to pasture, never could figure why he was so keen on it. They rode out the next morning, Evelyn behind James on the mule trail. When they reached the ridge, the wind changed. A scent of iron in the air, the soil darker underfoot. They found a shallow dig site, rusted tools, a vein of green-blue rock glinting from the wall. He found it, James murmured. Evelyn stepped back and didn't tell anyone. Not even me. She looked at him. Then why show me that bench? Why write about gardens, not copper? James's jaw flexed, because maybe he wanted something different, a new life with you. They rode back in silence. Merrick returned the next night. Not alone, they came just after dusk, 2 horses kicking up dust under a moon that hadn't yet cleared the ridge. Evelyn was folding linens in the parlor when she heard the sound, hooves, low voices, the scrape of leather dismounting. She set the linen down and reached for the lantern, her pulse loud in her ears. James was already at the door. He didn't speak, only looked at her once, quiet, steady, then stepped outside. Merrick stood at the bottom stair, flanked by a taller man with a pistol low on his hip and a scar like a welt across his cheek. Evening, Merrick said, voice too smooth. Didn't want to believe the stories, but there it is, Caleb's little stake, plain as day. Looks like we were both right after all. James didn't move. You brought trouble to my door, Merrick. That was your first mistake. The taller man laughed, harsh and low. Ain't here for blood, just the claim, easy as handing over a deed and we're gone. There is no deed, James said. Merrick's eyes narrowed. He wouldn't have dug that deep without securing it. Evelyn stepped out behind James. Maybe he wanted it buried. Merrick looked at her, something sour flickering in his gaze. You're the bride, ain't you? She didn't answer. He stepped closer. You spent time in that house. Read his things. Where is it? James stepped forward, 1 pace. His hand rested on the butt of his revolver. Merrick saw it and lifted his palms slightly. No need for that. We're reasonable men. You ain't men, James said, voice hardening. You're vultures. The taller man took a step toward the porch, hand twitching toward his hip. Evelyn's voice cut the air, sharp and clear. You'll find nothing here. Whatever Caleb left, it wasn't for you. There was silence. Then Merrick's voice turned flat. You're making this harder than it needs to be. James tilted his head. You came this far. You know how this ends. Merrick stared him down, then backed a step. We'll be around. That mine's still in the hills. You can't watch it forever. He turned, mounted slow. The scarred man lingered a beat longer, then followed. They disappeared into the night. James locked every window that evening. Evelyn laid a shotgun on the table and lit every lamp. The house glowed like a beacon in the dark. Caleb never mentioned them, she asked. James shook his head. No, but he must have known they'd come. Then why leave the map? James looked at her, something unreadable behind his eyes. Maybe he trusted you. She sat across from him. I don't want the copper. I don't either, he said, but they'll keep circling. We need to finish what he started. She knew what that meant, a deed, a legal claim, proof of ownership or forfeiture. It had to be somewhere. They searched again, by lamplight this time, scouring Caleb's things with new urgency. In the lining of his saddlebag, stitched into the seam, they found a folded sheet of oilcloth. Inside, an official claim, signed and sealed, dated 2 weeks before his death. He never mailed it, Evelyn whispered. James traced the signature with his thumb. He was waiting, maybe for you. She looked up at him, the ache of it rising again. If he hadn't died. James didn't answer. He just nodded, slow and sure, like a man agreeing with something neither of them could bear to say aloud. They rode into town the next morning with the document sealed in a tin box. At the clerk's office, James signed the transfer under witness. He didn't put his name on the claim. He put hers. You sure? She asked, voice shaking. He looked at her then, steadily, not with kindness but with faith. It was meant for you. Let it stay that way. She turned the tin in her hands, feeling the weight of it settle differently now. On the ride home, they didn't speak, but the road between them had changed. They reached the house near sundown. The sky was stained in rust and lavender. As they approached the porch, Evelyn paused. There was movement by the garden. A woman stood there, wrapped in a faded shawl, her figure slim, hair dark and bound. She turned slowly. James stopped beside Evelyn, his breath catching. The woman looked at them both. Then she spoke. "I'm looking for Caleb Rusk." The woman's voice was soft, but there was a steadiness beneath it, a wire pulled tight. Evelyn stepped down from the porch first, the tin box still warm in her arms. "He's gone," she said. 3 months now." The woman didn't move. "I know." James came up behind her, face gone pale. "Then why ask?" The woman's gaze moved to him, and he saw it, the resemblance. Faint, but there. The tilt of the jaw, the quiet in the eyes. "I'm Sarah," she said, "Caleb's wife." Evelyn felt the words like a hand across her chest. "No," James said, voice hushed. "That can't be." Sarah didn't flinch. "We were married 2 winters ago, in Arizona territory. He left not long after, said he needed to set things right with his brother." James stepped back as if struck. Evelyn's arms slackened around the tin box. "I never knew," he said. "He didn't want anyone to," Sarah replied. "He said it was safer, that he'd write when it was time to come." "But he was writing me," Evelyn said quietly. "He was planning to marry me." Sarah looked at her then, not cruelly, not with judgment, but with something deeper. Weariness, perhaps, or heartbreak. "He never stopped writing me either," she said. "Letters every month, said the land was nearly ready, said he had plans." James turned toward the horizon, jaw clenched. "He lied to both of you." Sarah nodded once. "Seems he did." The wind picked up, rustling the garden. Evelyn stepped aside, gesturing to the house. "You should come in." Sarah looked uncertain, but the sun was low and the road behind her long. Inside, the silence was thick as wool. Evelyn made tea. Sarah stood near the mantel, hands clasped. James poured himself a drink, then another. He didn't sit. "How'd you find us?" he asked. Sarah looked toward the window. "He mentioned Jesper's Hollow once. I came through Danton's Creek, heard he was buried here. A shopkeeper gave me the rest." She turned to Evelyn. "I didn't know about you." "I didn't know about you either." They stared at one another for a long, raw moment. Nothing angry passed between them, only a shared grief, like 2 trees twisted by the same wind. James finally spoke. He left the copper to Evelyn, made out the claim in her name. Sarah nodded slowly. "That sounds like him, a man who built futures he couldn't keep." "I don't want it," Evelyn said, "not without knowing what's right." Sarah looked toward the fire, her voice low. "He was never good at endings, but I think, in his way, he wanted to leave something that might outlive him." The 3 of them sat late into the night. The fire crackled low. Outside, an owl called once, then fell silent. In the morning, Evelyn found Sarah out by the creek, standing near the bench. Dew clung to the grass, the mist rising pale and silver. "He talked about this place," Sarah said, not turning. "Said it was quiet, said he wanted to grow something here." "He told me that too." Sarah looked down at her hands. "Maybe he meant it, for both of us." Evelyn said nothing. She only stood beside her, the creek murmuring at their feet. Later, they gathered in the parlor. James set a map on the table. "There's more copper in that hill," he said, "enough to draw worse men than Merrick." Sarah looked at him. "Then we bury the entrance." "No claim." "No mine," Evelyn said. James folded the map. "You sure?" Sarah nodded. Evelyn did too. That afternoon they rode out again, the 3 of them. They carried shovels, canvas, stones. It took most of the day to fill the shaft, cover the opening, and scatter the dirt clean. James drove a post into the ground above it, no marker, just wood and silence. When they returned, their boots were stained red and their arms ached, but the air felt lighter somehow. That night, Evelyn and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one. "You staying?" Evelyn asked. Sarah pulled the shawl tighter. "Don't know yet. Nothing left for me down south." Evelyn glanced through the window where James stood by the fire. "There's room here." Sarah nodded, slow. "Maybe there's healing here too." They didn't speak again. They just sat, shoulder to shoulder, two women who'd both loved the same man and now held the pieces of what he left behind. The wind moved through the pines like a sigh. Somewhere deep in the hollow, the earth began to forget. Summer came slow to Jesper's hollow, brushing the hills in yellow clover and wild rye. The days grew long and honeyed, and the air began to taste of sun-warmed soil and creek water. In the mornings, Evelyn walked the garden rows barefoot, the earth soft beneath her feet, and thought about what roots meant, not just for plants, but for people. Sarah stayed. At first, she took the smallest room, speaking little, keeping to herself. But as the days passed, she began to help, patching a saddle, shelling peas, tending the hens with gentle hands. She sang to them sometimes, old hymns that curled around the rafters like prayer. Evelyn didn't ask why she hadn't left. She didn't need to. Some grief binds people. Other grief unbinds them from everything they knew. James worked as he always had, but the weight behind his shoulders had shifted. He no longer rode before dawn or returned after dark. Sometimes he came in early just to sit at the table with a cup of coffee and say nothing. And sometimes Evelyn joined him. They didn't speak of Caleb anymore, not out of shame or sorrow, but because the memory had settled. It no longer cut. It simply lived there, like dust in the corners, like the smell of pine smoke on flannel. One afternoon, thunder rolled low in the hills. Evelyn and Sarah rushed to bring in the laundry while James stabled the mule. Rain came in a sudden hush, soft at first, then full and clean. They gathered in the kitchen, damp and flushed. Evelyn poured coffee. Sarah lit a lamp. James brought in kindling. They moved around one another with a quiet grace, each knowing where the other would reach next. Not like family, not yet, but like something building. Later, when the rain had passed and the light outside turned blue with evening, Evelyn stepped onto the porch. James followed. She didn't turn to him, only spoke to the sky. Do you think he knew? Knew what? That we'd be here, all three of us. James was quiet a long time. Then he might have hoped. She looked over then. Would that make it worse? He met her eyes. No, just makes it real. They stood there, the hush of post-rain filling the space between them. Fireflies had begun to rise from the tall grass, blinking like slow pulses of breath. Inside, Sarah hummed to herself, a tune with no words, the kind that lingers in the walls. Evelyn turned toward James, something unspoken moving between them. You ever think about leaving? She asked. Used to. And now? He looked toward the hills. Not anymore. She nodded once. The truth of it sat warm between them. In the weeks that followed, new rhythms formed. Sarah took to keeping the books. Evelyn sold preserves and dyed cloth for the trading post. James started fencing off the lower field for goats. They argued sometimes, but never cruelly. They laughed, more often than any of them expected. They learned each other's silences. One evening in August, a hawk flew low over the garden, shadow sweeping the rows. Evelyn watched it from the creek's edge, hand resting on the bench Caleb had built. Sarah came up beside her, basket on her arm. The tomatoes are ready. Evelyn smiled. Bring Em in, I'll stew Em tonight. Sarah paused, then asked, Are we strange, do you think? Evelyn tilted her head. For what? For what we've become. Evelyn looked out across the land, where a trio of goats nibbled along the fence line, and beyond that the hills that held nothing now but stone and memory. No, she said, I think we're exactly what's needed. Later, as dusk bled across the horizon and the lamps in the house were lit one by one, James leaned against the doorframe and watched the two women move through the kitchen, the smells of garlic and sweet corn rising into the beams. He smiled just slightly, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was possible. Outside, beneath the stars, the hollow held its breath, and then slowly began to breathe again.